On Tragedy, we cover cases that involve real people and real events. Episodes may include discussions of violence, criminal behavior, and loss. We share these stories to honor those impacted and to raise awareness, but they may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Tragedy, a true crime podcast. I'm Alyssa.
And I'm Michael.
And for the past few weeks, we've been exploring what may have happened to Michael John Olson. And Michael went missing in December of 1979 from West Palm Beach, Florida. And tonight, we'd like to welcome to the podcast someone who's been really integral in keeping the story in the spotlight, and that is Paige Nienaber. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much.
All right, we're going to get right into it. Tell us what your connection is to Michael and what you would like our listeners to know about him.
Well, we grew up in a suburb of Minneapolis called Edina, and it's a big suburb, but at least when we were growing up, it had a very small town feel to it, where, everybody on the block knew each other. And I think there was even kind of a little main street. And, Mike's neighborhood, Arden Avenue, kind of epitomized that. They had their own little Arden Avenue 4th of July parade, which was a parody of the big community 4th of July parade. And we went to a school where, my graduating class was 500, but it was one of those schools where if you didn't know everybody, you at least knew of everybody because you had crossed their path in some way, shape, or form. So I had graduated with Michael's, younger brother, Jeff, and a year before his younger brother. And I believe I'd been in Little League with Mike, and I had friends who had been on the golf team with him and had worked with him at the local country club. So that was kind of my small town in a big suburb, connection with Mike. And I had been away at college. I was a freshman when this had all happened. And this was back when people used to communicate via mail. Right. And I remember getting a letter from somebody with, an update with what things were happening in Edina. And they had added that Mike Olson disappeared down in Florida. And, when you're 18 years old, that's just what a weird concept. Somebody who you knew even, tangentially or whatever, had disappeared. How does that happen? So that was kind of my connection to him, was through school and through youth athletics.
So you talked a little bit about how people started to find out about this disappearance. Can you tell us what you know about the day he disappeared, the events leading up to that, and how the family learned that he was missing?
He had gone down. He was always interested in working in the golf business, and not as a professional golfer, but as working in the management, the country club, that kind of thing. So he'd gone to the University of Minnesota for a year, and then through one of his contacts, one of his supervisors at the country club, Edina Country Club, let him know that there was this country club down in Florida called the President's Country Club in West Palm Beach. And not connected to the current president who's in West Palm Beach. It was a very upscale country club. And one of the things that they did every year was bring down a group of young men from the northern tier states to work their busy season, because they had a clientele that if their tee time was 9:06, they expected to hit the ball at 9:06. So they brought in extra bodies to help. And so for Mike, this was, tremendous opportunity to get some PGA accreditation through work and get some experience. And then, here's a bunch of young guys that, late in the afternoon, early evening, when everybody was finished golfing, they got to go out and golf on one of the, premier golf courses in America. And he'd been down there. He'd driven down with his brother, Jeff, and had been there for 10 days or 2 weeks and had been kind of bopping around from motel to motel as all these young guys were trying to get settled and pair up and find roommates for the season. And he had gone out. It was a Friday. He had not worked, but had spent the day trying to find an apartment. and everybody got together at the Howard Johnson's where they were staying at. And, the plan for the evening was that they were going to go out and eventually meet up at a nightclub. So Mike and one of his coworkers, Jim, headed out. They went to a place called the Palm Beach Kennel Club, and then they went to a bar called the Wild Side, and then they went to another dance club. And at some point, other members of that crew, the bag room crew, tried to connect with them or find them, but they were never at the bar that they were supposed to be at. They'd changed plans or something. And at about 5 a.m, Mike, who had been driving, dropped off his coworker Jim at his car that was in a church parking lot near the kennel club, and said, I'll probably be a little late, see you in a couple hours, and headed back to the Howard Johnsons. And somewhere between the Belvedere Baptist Church and the Howard Johnsons, which was 1.5 miles away, he disappeared. And so the next day, he didn't show up for work. And my understanding was that one of the supervisors in the at the country club was known, but for better terms, was kind of a hard ass. So Mike didn't show up on time, so they immediately called the hotel to get up, wake up. And there wasn't an answer in his room, so they called back later. And eventually somebody from the hotel went down and checked his room, and all of his stuff was in there. So the next day they went over, and didn't show up the next day. They went over to the Howard Johnsons and, checked, and they went back in, checked the room, and all of his stuff was still there. It wasn't until the next morning that his supervisor, Jim, there was a couple of Jims involved. His supervisor, Jim, reached out to the West Palm Beach West Palm Beach Police Department and filed a missing persons report, at which point Mike had been out of the pocket for 53 hours. So it had been a long time before a report was finally filed. And my understanding is that somebody from the country club actually called, while all this was going on, called Mike's old employer at the Edina Country Club and just said, hey, has he called you or anything? He hasn't shown up for work. Well, this is so unlike the guy that his supervisor at the country club immediately called the family and said, you need to call West Palm Beach. Something's going on. And the family was already aware because he had a scheduled phone call with his brother the night before that he had missed. So my understanding is that that's how the family found out that he was missing. And the police department got involved.
Can you clarify for me, because I've done a little bit of reading up on this case. Can you just clarify that the gym that he was at the kennel club with, and then the other guys that worked at the bag shop at the club, they weren't all together that night? They had separated or split up?
Yeah, one of the guys in the bag room, Brad, he and Mike, he was staying in the same hotel, and he and Mike had decided that they were going to get an apartment together. So Brad had headed out to actually look at apartments that night. And then there was 1 or 2 other people from the room from the hotel, who were going to connect with them at a place called Mr. G's, which was a dance club. Mike and his coworker who went out with him that night, they apparently changed plans because they didn't go to Mr. G's. They went to a place called the Wild Side instead, and then later went to Mr. G's. But the guy who had gone to meet them at Mr. G's eventually just gave up and left because they hadn't showed up.
Had they arranged a time to meet? Because obviously this is before cell phones.
Yeah, we can't just say, hey, where are you?
No. My understanding was that there was a time that they were going to eventually connect.
Gotcha.
Okay. That's helpful. Is there anything that you know of that Michael was involved in that might have put him at any kind of a risk? Because when we have a missing person, there are several different things that may have happened.
Well, I remember I got back that summer, the following summer, and I remember, it came up in conversation a few times, that Mike Olson had disappeared in Florida. Well, in 1979, why would a 20-year-old from Minnesota be down in Florida? Exactly. But which was not further from the truth. And by the way, it was so completely out of character with the guy or his family. No, there were absolutely no indications. No, one of the first things the West Palm Beach Police Department did was they contacted law enforcement in Minnesota, and they had never had any interaction with him. The challenge was that he had, the day of the disappearance, gone out to try to apply, I think, to a rental agency that searched for apartments or something. And he had cashed a check for $700 from his father that was meant for rent. And so he had the equivalent of about $3,000 in cash with him. And by anything that I've heard about the Palm Beach Kennel Club at that time was that it was in transition. And it was kind of a seedy place with kind of some shady characters. Not the kind of place where you would have a wallet with the equivalent of $3,000 and be flashing it around. But when you're 20 years old, you're omnipotent. You don't think about risk or anything like that.
You don't know any better right now.
No. And then, then they went to this place called the Wild Side to see a Sugar Ray Leonard fight that was being telecast from Las Vegas. I used a thing called newspapers.com and had done some searches about the Wild Side, and it lived up to its name. It had had a lot of violence and shootings and stuff. So what happened was, after Mike's disappearance, the country, with future seasonal hirings, the country club gave these young guys a list of places that you do not go to. Don't go to these places. But, he was out and he had money with him. It's possible, that somebody saw that and saw an opportunity.
Well, when you said that, it made me think of, I remember when I was in the military, the Navy gave us a list of places not to go. And guess what would be the first places we went?
The first place on the list.
So I'm not sure how effective that would have been anyway. So
I look back to when I was 20 years old. I was the stupidest 20-year-old out there.
Oh, yeah.
And
Same here.
I'm surprised I'm still around. I mean, I just, but they were just out. And they were living, he was having the time of his life. He was getting to work in a job that he loved, getting to golf for free, and hanging out with people who were absolutely dialed into the same mindset that he was. They all wanted to work in the golf industry. And what's really has been sad for me is that, tracking down these guys, several of them went on to careers in the golfing industry, which was, they went on to live Mike's dream.
Yeah.
job. I mean, it's so sad.
Yeah. I do understand that you talked about the potential of a good chunk of cash. And if I'm not misunderstanding, it seems like they were driving around in his car, which from what I can understand was also a very nice car. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, he had a brand new Pontiac Grand Prix. And he had not had it for very long. And one of the things that, Mike's father, he was quoted in a Minneapolis newspaper article, I think it was for the first anniversary. And just, they'd gone down there, and it's a big change from Edina, Minnesota to that part of Florida, and learning about how there were all these gangs that would target you for your car. And, he had learned, what a chop shop was, and that they could take a car and make it disappear in 60 minutes. And that had actually been one of the rumors that had bounced around in the bag room, was that the car had ended up being shipped to the Bahamas, which apparently in that era, that was something that was common, that you stole a car and you resold it in the Bahamas. So yeah, he did have a brand new car, and he did have some money on him. So he was, he had a target on it.
And something else that I think is interesting about this case is the geographical proximity of all of these places, from the hotel that he was staying at to the kennel club to where the car was parked. It seems like this was a pretty tight area. Even though they were going from place to place, they weren't going far.
Oh my God, absolutely. I flew down there for the first dive that was going to happen, and flew into West Palm Beach, got my rental car. And, I've been to Florida many times. I'm from Minnesota. That's what you do. But I hadn't been to West Palm Beach. And, from getting from the airport to the location of the first dive, it was like 8 minutes. And then everything was so close to it. And, the hotel to where the country club was 6 or 7 minutes. It was a very tight, compact little area.
Now, this brings me to what I wanted to make sure we also address are these search efforts. So you mentioned the dive. Can you tell us what you know about any of the search efforts?
Well, that was one of the things that first, in 2025, it's, you hear all the time about these cars that are found in the water that had been there forever. in talking with people that were at the country club and still live in southern Florida. Several of these people still are down there, and they immediately say, "Oh yeah, we always thought he was in the water." But when you look through the police report, it barely got a mention. I ended up talking to the family had been so disillusioned with the police. After their very first meeting, they went out and hired a private investigator who he was kind of the Magnum PI of Southern Florida. I mean, even if you look at photos of him, he looked like a movie star. And he had been the private investigator of the rich and famous for decades. So when he retired, there was a big magazine article in Miami about him. And he was referencing, the case. And so I thought, we were trying to, the police files were so sparse that we were trying to get any kind of information. I thought, we got the Mike's father had kept notes and was a meticulous note taker, very intelligent guy. We thought maybe the private investigator would still have his files. Well, he had passed away. And as part of his directive when he passed away was that all of his files would be destroyed. But I was able to get in touch with one of his associates. And this was a guy who had ended up working for him, but wasn't working for him at the time, but had been with the West Palm Beach Police Department. And he was familiar with the case. He said, I'd always thought that he was in the water. He said, I was just so disappointed that they didn't search for him in the water. And I said, how do you know that they didn't search for him in the water? He said, I was the dive guy. I was the dive person for the police department. They never asked me. They asked to borrow my boat. And that was in the police report, where there was a quick notation that they borrowed a boat to look at a body of water. But his thing was, they never looked in the water. So when I first stumbled on this thing, I pulled up an aerial map of West Palm Beach from 1979 and then one from today. And directly behind the hotel is this wedge-shaped pond. And I thought, he's there. He's coming back. It's 5 a.m. He's been out all night. He pulls in. Instead of taking a right into the hotel parking lot, he takes a left. Boom, he's in the water. So I reached out to, I found a dive company that trains police divers. And I reached out to them and I said, for a training exercise, could you go and look in this pond? And they said, no. They said, no, we don't go in there because of alligators. So great. So then I went to a Southern Florida dive enthusiast social media page and asked simply, I said, is anybody up for an adventure? And almost immediately was contacted by Dark Water Dive of Jacksonville. And we'll be down there in 2 weeks. And so they came in and spent an afternoon. It was very rudimentary. They were using a rope with a magnet on it, and then they had divers in the water. So they did the pond behind the hotel, and then they did some bodies of water on either side of Congress. Mike would have left the church, gone up Congress for about 1.5 miles, taken a right, and then boom, been right in the Hojos. So they checked bodies of water on either side of that. And then they, if Mike, maybe because he'd been drinking, decided he wasn't going to take, even at 5 a.m., a reasonably busy road, he would take the back roads to get back to the Hojos. There are a number of ponds and canals and places back there, and they searched those, and they didn't have any luck. But what's happened with this story is every time there has been any kind of coverage, like a podcast like this, anytime there's been anything, almost immediately somebody will reach out and go, hey, I've got such and such skill set. I'd love to help. So after the NBC story about Dark Water Dive, Sunshine State Sonar reached out. And they have state-of-the-art equipment. They're fantastic at what they do. They had just, when they reached out to me, they had just helped Miami-Dade close a case from 1984 where a woman had put her children to bed, left suicide notes with them, and then vanished. They found her in an afternoon. So I was like, okay, that's credentials. So they have, for the last year, gone in and just hit every pond or canal within miles of this place. And so they found 100 cars so far. but not Mike's.
Yeah, one thing that, obviously we found out about this case through them.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that was really compelling about that story is they indicated that there was one particular time that they had found so many cars right there on top of each other that they had used up all the available towing resources in the area, and actually somewhat, I think, angered local law enforcement because of the amount of towing that was happening in these various areas.
The family had immediate disillusionment with West Palm Beach Police Department. When their first meeting with them, first of all, they were kept waiting for hours. When they had their first meeting with them, they were told flat out, Mike's a big boy. Mike doesn't need your permission to get in his car and go for a drive. Can you imagine that? And it continues today. It's very difficult to receive any reply or anything from the West Palm Beach Police Department. And so the day that they had the dive that shut down, the tow truck service, the cold case detective and an officer showed up, and instead of, I'm not suggesting that they give them medals or anything like that, they threatened them with arrest for diving illegally.
Yeah, one of the things that we asked when we talked to them is, I was like, do you get permits? They were like, no.
No, we just kind of make it happen.
We just kind of go. And you're describing why. Because that would just delay what needs to happen.
Somebody was asking me, how one of my friends from high school was like, how much money have you spent on this? And I said, nothing. These dive recovery teams, they're cowboys, man. They're modern cowboys. They're doing it for the adventure. They're doing it for the notoriety, and they're doing it for the competitiveness, and God bless them for doing it. And, and they have cleared. I reached out to at the West Palm Beach Police Department, and then you have the Palm Beach Sheriff's Department. Okeechobee, which is a busy street. The Hojo's was on the north side of Okeechobee by about 200 feet. It was in the West Palm Beach Police Department jurisdiction. Everything south of Okeechobee is the Sheriff's Department. So when we reached out to them a year ago or a year and a half ago to say, could we see what your files, or could you at least tell us, is there anything in your files? They were like, we've never heard of this case.
Uh-huh.
And like, are you kidding me? But they work hand in hand, like so many different law enforcement agencies welcome, solicit, reach out to Sunshine State Sonar and say, please help us. And then you have the West Palm Beach Police Department who's like, no, we'll arrest you.
Yeah, one thing that we've discovered as we've kind of grown as a podcast is we've had a number of conversations with various reporters, various contacts, law enforcement agencies, and, it's interesting. We were working with the Wakulla County Sheriff's Office, and we were just kind of getting stonewalled the entire time. And what we found is this is not uncommon. And they indicated too, the same thing that you're saying is there's some departments that will be, highly communicative, and there'll be others that will completely shut you down, and there's really nothing you can do to get through. And there's really not a lot of rhyme and reason for it.
No, I reached out to the Palm Beach Sheriff's Department last week and just kind of updated them on what's going on. And they were so nice and so welcoming and promised to keep me in the loop. And which, and I know that they're obviously really busy and they don't know who I am, but they were absolutely, gracious about it.
So what do you think happened? What does your gut tell you?
I think you have a couple of scenarios. One, he's in the water. And that's what everybody thinks. The Pontiac Grand Prix, brand new. He was learning how to handle it. One of the sonar guys, that was his first car. It was in Pontiac Grand Prix, which is a classic hunk of American metal. And he described it as cornering like a tank. So if Mike is driving back, maybe he got lost or whatever, he misjudges a curve in the road, it would be very easy to end up in the water. 2, foul play. It would require 2 people to get him and the car. They would have had to tag him and follow him all night long until he was free of his coworker, and then they could get him. Carjacking, highly unlikely. There was only one stoplight on the way back to the Hojo's, and even at 5 a.m, there's enough cars on that road that it would have been difficult to pull off. It would have had to be in the Hojo's parking lot. And there was a guest in the police report, and it was just a tiny little reference to this, and they never followed up on it. that they had heard a commotion in the parking lot, or they'd heard a sound. I think they used the term noise or a sound in the parking lot, but that they had not chosen to look out the window or anything. So foul play. The third and a half possibilities are that, he's a young guy, he's out at bars, maybe he met somebody. And he either told his coworker or he didn't tell his coworker, but he dropped his friend off at his car and then went back to meet somebody. And then maybe there's a boyfriend or a husband, something like that. And then the final possibility, and this was brought up by Mike's supervisor at the country club, was that he believed that the story that was told to the police was whitewashed, was cleaned to protect Mike from any embarrassment, because they absolutely expected that he was going to walk in the door any day. Like, what 20-year-old hasn't gone off and done something stupid and then kind of dragged themselves in? So knowing that Mike's going to show up any day, why tell the police everything? And then, of course, when Mike doesn't show up, well, are you going to go back to the police and say, well, actually, we did this, and this? No, he's stuck with the lie.
So from your perspective, how has Mike's disappearance impacted his family? Even this, it's what?
Oh, it's just crushing.
I can't do the math, but several years later.
Right. Crushing. I can't speak for his siblings. I just know that through his nieces that at one point, I really wanted to get the grandfather or their grandfather's notes. Everything, he had saved everything, including like a tray liner from the Howard Johnsons that he'd scribbled notes on and stuff. And it took them some time to really just sit down with their father and work with him, because I can't even imagine. The nieces, for me, have always been the champions of the case. When I started first kicking this around in 2022, I think it was, anytime I went, trying to learn more about it, whenever I went to an article or story about it, they'd already been there and they had, commented about it and stuff. But I know that it's just left an incredible void in their life.
One of the things anytime we're kind of wrapping up these interviews, is there anything that we haven't thought to ask yet that you would like to share?
Well, I reached out to somebody I knew in 2023 that, I don't know what I'm doing. This is not something I do. And I needed somebody to kick me in the head. So I reached out to a woman named Jenny Decker, who researches and investigates this stuff. And like everybody else, Mike's coworker, who he spent the night with, first of all, he was interviewed 4 times by law enforcement. I would think that it would be incredibly difficult to lie on 4 occasions successfully to law enforcement. They never suspected that this guy had anything to do with it. The private investigator, when he retired and they did the magazine article about him, he referenced the case and he referred to this young man as something to the effect of, if this guy's involved, I need to rethink every judgment call I ever made. With that said, you always have to go back to who was the last person to see him. And, I've reached out to him and he's been able to supply some information about the night and stuff, but he was the person, the whole narrative, the timeline of everything that happened depends on this individual. And there have been a couple of things, and these are all subjective, that make you wonder, maybe more happened that night that he didn't tell the police, or maybe, who knows? But you always have to go back. And that's every time somebody new has come on board, they always start at the beginning with, who is this guy you spent the entire night with?
It's hard to avoid it. I mean, it's just,
no.
Bottom line is, this is the last person that we know have seen him. And, do we believe his story? We know their night changed throughout the evening. It's definitely one of the things when I first heard about this story, one of the first things I told Elise, I'm like, I kind of want to talk to this guy.
He's difficult to get in touch with. But, and it's, again, 46 years is a tremendous amount of time.
Uh-huh.
And people, every time I've reached out to somebody regarding this. There have been varying levels of emotion. When I finally got in touch with his supervisor, his reply was, he said, I've always expected this call. I've always wanted this call. I always knew this call was going to happen. I've prayed. I go to Google several times a year just to look for updates, see if anything had happened, anything had cracked the case and stuff. The young man who had gone out looking for apartments that night instead of joining them, he started crying when I reached out to him. When I reached out to this other individual, the person who had spent the night with him, his response was kind of flat. He said, "Oh, the guy who disappeared." And by the way, email is not the best conveyor of emotion. And I also found out just going through social media that we have a mutual friend. So I reached out to her and I said, what can you tell me about this guy? And she said, salt of the earth. So, I think that he just was unfortunate enough to have been part of this story and probably, has chosen to move on with his life.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
No. I just, if when I was 20 years old, I had been part of an event like this and I was, interviewed by the police, interviewed by the media, and somebody all these years later asked me, I don't know if I would just go, oh yeah, the guy who disappeared.
Yeah, I mean,
I know where you're about to go with this. I'll let you go.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I've had to come to terms with, though, as we've gone through with these different interviews through various cases, is to be careful not to think that, well, this isn't how I would react. Now, do I think that's a strange reaction? The answer is absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But I've learned that people respond in different ways. Some people that you think should be broken up on something have no reaction, and people that were mildly involved have an extreme reaction.
And people you would think would be banging down the door to talk are the actual people who don't want to say anything.
No,
and then you're like, but why?
And my wife and I are very different people. I tend to hold on to old friends and acquaintances that I've known for years and years. Anne is very much just like, she was my friend in college, but, she has her own life now. And that's entirely fine. And I totally get it.
Yeah, we try to be really careful with making sure that just because someone chooses to not participate does not mean they have something to hide.
No,
right?
I was able to, the father had kept notes, and he had in the notes, he had a list of the young men who were worked in the bag room. And I don't know whether he was taking their names over the phone or anything, but it was, there were misspellings or phonetic, spellings or something, or Brad B or something, or one of them was Tim J, Michigan. So I was able to track down pretty much everybody from the bag room. There's one person who absolutely denied ever working there. And then there was another person who just did not want to talk. And, I totally get it. I mean, you've moved on with your life.
The one that denied ever working there is really interesting.
Yeah. And you know what? It's entirely possible that, and I forget who it was, maybe, the father wrote down Robert C. or something like that, and somebody pointed me in the wrong direction.
Yeah, makes sense.
Well, we just want to thank you so much for coming and sharing this story. Do you have any other last thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners?
Well, the goal is there's one body of water that was not searched, and it's Clear Lake. And in fact, one of the guys who worked at the bag room now is a realtor down in Florida. And he was telling one of the other researchers, I've always thought he was in Clear Lake. If Mike, he's coming back, takes a right, misses the immediately left into the Howard Johnsons, he's on the causeway and he's going over Clear Lake. That would be a place to look. It's 500 yards from the hotel. The challenge is that it's the West Palm Beach Water Department. Their plant is on Clear Lake, which makes it a sensitive or secure site. It's administered by the Department of Homeland Security. There is no diving, no boating, nothing goes in the water. And there have been even a couple of the dive teams have gone down there and stood on the shore just to surveil the lake. And there's been law enforcement response within 4 minutes. So, I reached out to the mayor and didn't get a reply. It would be fantastic if they could eliminate, and this is all a process of elimination, if they could eliminate Clear Lake, well, then that takes something pretty big out of the equation.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're familiar with the Department of Homeland Security being around dams and things. We do a lot of fly fishing. And so
Right.
we'll get as close as we can. And then we're like, oh, we can't go any further. And we get it because, you know, you don't want people blowing up dams and flooding areas. So like it totally makes sense. So that's not foreign to us.
No, these are not rollicking circus clowns. They have a serious job.
Absolutely. And I remember Mike with Sunshine State Sonar mentioned Clear Lake. And then I looked at it on, Google Earth, and I was kind of, tracing out possible routes. And, I agree with both of you. I'm like, that needs to be searched.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That is a very big possibility based on what we know in the direction and the getting, the factors around getting lost, in that area. I mean, yeah, that needs to be searched.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, the family had hired a psychic. I think it's Laura Brown. I forget the name, but she was like a big deal psychic. And she had
Sylvia Brown?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, I just gave away my age. She used to be on Maury Povich and Sally Jesse Raphael. I can even picture her in my mind. It's Sylvia Brown.
I got half the name right. Yeah, they hired her. And she had said that he was in the water.
Yeah, I remember her being very matter of fact. She's not a storyteller kind of lady, because I've seen her on several things and people ask and she'll give like a 1 or 2 sentence and she is literally no tact. Like she'll just say it. She'll say, your loved one has passed away. And then she'll go to the next. And it's like, right. She's just going to say it and go on. But I know who you're talking about. So,
right.
Any other last thoughts? Anything that's come to mind?
Well, I just appreciate, the fact that you're helping out. Again, every time there's been any coverage of this. And, when I first started out, just when I first rediscovered the story, I went out for cocktails with some friends from high school at this place called Lord Fletcher's in the Twin Cities. And one of the guys was retiring as the chief of police from one of the western suburbs. And he himself had just closed a triple cold case arson case. And he'd done it. And it was just like, oh my God, I never knew you were this sneaky. He had used the NBC affiliate in the Twin Cities to run a story at the same time that they were inside this guy's house interviewing him so that it was on TV. So they're in the process of interviewing this guy and there's the story on TV. And apparently he just started sweating bullets or something. But, his thing was, he dramatically lowered my expectations. Very early on, I was just thinking, well, maybe what I'll do is I'll get a collection, and from the students in Mike's class, and it's Edina, Minnesota. They have the money. Get a collection from these guys, and we'll put up a billboard in West Palm Beach. And what I found out was that there's not a lot of outdoor advertising or billboards in West Palm Beach. There's not down there. So what he had said was, only in movies does somebody drive past a billboard and go, oh my God, Alyssa. In 1979, I was working with this woman named Alyssa. And I remember she came in this one day and, that only happens in movies. So he lowered my expectations. But his thing was that my goal was to keep a light shining on it and that nothing bad would ever happen from keeping, attention on the case, and that he was sure that the West Palm Beach Police Department had file cabinets filled with hundreds of folders of missing persons cases, and that the goal was to be so annoying that they couldn't ignore me. So I've accomplished half of that, but they still ignore me.
Well,
we know that too.
Here's the good news: we're going to help you be annoying. We're going to do that.
Thank you very much.
We're going to help you be annoying. See how many more flashlights can we shine this direction.
Let's just turn them all on. You've been listening to Tragedy, a true crime podcast. Our purpose is to honor victims by sharing their stories through the voices of friends, family, and those whose lives were forever changed. If today's episode resonated with you, we encourage you to follow, leave a review, and share the podcast so these important stories continue to be heard. Together, we can preserve their memories and ensure their voices are never forgotten. If you have ideas for cases we should cover or questions about what you heard, you can connect with us through our Facebook group, Tragedy, a True Crime Podcast, on X @Tragedy Podcast, by email, tragedyaTrueCrimePodcast@gmail.com, or by visiting our website, www.tragedyaTrueCrimePodcast.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time.